Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Welcome to the Imaginaries, where we are going to tell you today about all kinds of imaginary things as they pertain to planets and moons, alien planets, future Earths. Who knows where we're going to go? We're going to go everywhere. This is the third in our Mars, Moon, and Others series, and today we're talking about the Others. So if you haven't yet listened to our Moon and Mars podcasts, they are unrelated to this one, other than that we are grouping them together, so you don't really have to. But, you know, we like it when you listen to us, so please do.
I'm sobbing.
Sobbing for the non-listeners.
Sobbing for the non-listeners. That's okay. But
Yeah.
we are here, and we're doing good, right?
Yep. We're doing great. So it's the two of us again today, and we are going to really cover everything.
Everything.
I mean, everything. Anything that is importantly, however that importance may take its form, plotted or based or staged or bounded or whatever on an alien planet, an alien moon, another version of Earth, whether that's future or alternate. We are going to talk about it all today and see what we can pull out of it and really think about settings, alien worlds or non-alien worlds as our future or alternate Earths may be, and what they do, how they might be similar, why they keep popping up, because science fiction is a lot of alien planets. So we're gonna try and pull out some threads and talk about some things in particular. We are gonna talk about what it means to be a planet and what it means to try and reproduce a planet.
Are you a planet?
I am a planet. I am coming here to you from another planet. I am a planet on a planet. It is hot planet on planet action, and let's dive into it.
Okay.
So, I think that is actually a great place to start if we want to talk about our planet discussion and begin with what it means to be a planet or to make a planet and to try and reproduce a planet. Because one of the things that I put on our show notes today is that we could try and talk about things like space stations and Dyson spheres and ring worlds and etc. And those things that sort of take what is essential for life, like us, about a planet and, you know, put it in some sort of tin can in space as a place where people live, as a way to sort of think about, well, what are these things that we're talking about when we talk about planets?
Well, and I think perhaps at some point in the future, dedicating an entire podcast to the space station and the spaceship might be something that we should do, because I think that
absolutely.
These ecologies and these societies that we create to populate our space stations and our spaceships are themselves like the distillate of you know whatever the thought experiment is of the book. So yeah, I think that would be great, and we can definitely start by contrasting those cultures to planets here today. So what makes a station different from a planet, and does that help us get closer to defining what a planet is and is not?
Right. And for me, the first thing that I think of immediately is, actually kind of two ideas that are enfolded within one another. The first is just, in almost all cases, the space station or sphere or ring world or whatever it is going to be smaller than a planet. And even if it isn't, it's going to be laid out differently. So you're going to have some sort of like difference in geography, difference in orientation, whether that is functional or whether it's aesthetic. You know, whether you're looking at one of those stations like Babylon 5, and I know there's a name for this category, but I can't think of what it is. But you have basically like the living area is on the inside of a giant rotating cylinder, or you have something like a ring world that's replicating livable area, but obviously is laid out really differently, versus if you have something that's small, like a space station like Deep Space Nine in Star Trek, that is, you know, living quarters for a whole lot of people, but is obviously nowhere near the size of a planet. But so that's the first thing, and entangled within that is this idea that you don't have those natural or unoccupied spaces. Those spaces that are not functional in some way. And I think that functional is a really loaded word. So if we're thinking of like, biological production of oxygen or biological recycling of water, like then we get into thinking about, what do different ecosystems do on Earth. And that's generally something, if we're thinking of science fiction that's either written or on screen or whatever, that is either kind of glossed over or looked at very directly. But that sort of like planetary interlocking of systems and how they function to form functional biospheres is something that I think is very indicative of planets, and you only see in works of science fiction with, structures that are trying to reproduce planets, when the authors or the creators are really, really thinking about what is a planet, what makes a planet work.
And, I think that there are exceptions to the rule, or perhaps this is actually the example of your rule, which is to say Kim Stanley's Aurora, in which the biospheres of the generation ship upon which they travel, the Aurora, are in fact the primary focus of the book. The development of these biospheres, how they work together, how they interact with the microbiome in the human body, how these actually end up being a safer place to live than perhaps the actual planetary bodies themselves. I think that he, in a sense, he kind of muddles it up in a really pleasurable way in that book.
Yeah.
And I would also say that this connects really neatly with one of my kind of theories about what makes what draws an author to a book set on a planet or on Earth as opposed to on Mars or the moon, which is the possibilities for landscape. As we talked about in our previous podcast for the moon and Mars, if you're taking a quote-unquote big air quotes here, hard science approach to writing your sci-fi novel, then you can't ignore the fact that at present, these planetary bodies, these solar system bodies, are not habitable and are not going to be lush with, varied scenery of the traditional sense anytime soon. And that is why we talked about terraforming as being one of the primary attractants of these, those other bodies. Whereas on Earth or on these not quite Earths that we're talking about, or maybe definitely not Earths, they provide the opportunity for lush description. And that's not something that you're ever going to be able to make an easy thing on Mars unless you completely, skip, 500 years or something and head straight for basically science fantasy, which assumes that we don't need to know how we got from point A to point C.
Yeah.
That's my theory.
Yeah, no, and that's really interesting that, setting works on other worlds really gives you access, gives an author and therefore a reader access to these landscapes that you wouldn't otherwise have. This sort of pastoral imaginary of what an alien world can be. And, I'm thinking of how that can be really beautiful in everything from, movies that provide you with just endless splendors of alien ecologies. Maybe James Cameron's Avatar is a good go-to there just for its visuals, to, something even like Joe Haldeman's Forever War, which visits a lot of different planets, and including some that are super bleak, that are, completely dark, so far away from their suns. Some of his characters are either on Pluto or Charon. I forget which, because it's been a while since I've read it, but he renders the landscape of the planet in such a way that you might be fooled into thinking you're reading about a really beautiful place, even though it's horrible and harsh and a terrible place.
Well, you just want to die terribly. You're able to absorb the texture of the place in a way that you aren't in a more sterile environment. And as a writer who's currently working on a a space bound body that is not a planet, I can tell you that it's super hard to exercise the lush descriptive, muscle that I have very well developed in the past, and it's super hard to do that on something that is as small and dinky as an asteroid or a spaceship or a space station, unless you happen to be super creative, which I'm, working on, but it's not something that everyone comes gifted with. And I think there are plenty of examples out there of authors who try and succeed, as well as authors who try and fail, to kind of capture what it must be like to live on a constrained body as opposed to a large one. And in a sense, it's easier to go with, write what you know, or however that, expression goes, by setting something on an Earth where you can start with the basic assumption that, yes, we get to be descriptive and things are going to be the same as they are now unless we specify that they're different. Instead of building it from the ground up. So that's that's an important thing to consider from the input end of things, that authors are choosing these different locations not just because they woke up in the middle of the night with this scene in their head, although some of them do, but a lot of times they're choosing this setting deliberately because it fits their purpose and it's the right tool for the job, or it's easier than the alternative.
Right. And it just gives them leeway to be imaginative. We know so much about our own solar system, and I know there's a whole lot we don't know, but setting a book on Mars today, setting a movie on Mars today, is a much different prospect than doing it, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, even 10 years ago, even a year ago. We're learning more all the time, which is amazing and wonderful, and, works incorporating that new science are really, I think, just to be commended because things change so rapidly. But at the same time, that certainty, the scientific certainty of those things, I think also can take away some of the grandeur of the imagination on the part of creators of science fiction. And so by engaging these, alien planets, these places we haven't been yet, whether they're in our solar system or far beyond, does some interesting things that we couldn't otherwise do. And within our solar system, I'm thinking of Pamela Sargent's Venus trilogy, if you want books set on Venus, or Kim Stanley Robinson's 2312, if you want to go to other planets in the solar system. Mercury was the most memorable
opening
one for me
sequence on Mercury, the sunrise on Mercury, is amazing. That is still one of my favorite passages from science fiction of the last decade. And while the rest of the book may not display quite that degree of finesse, the scope of his scientific knowledge marries so beautifully with the scope of his imagination in that scene. And that is, that's the heart of what I want out of a book, is that science and also that scale that imagination provides, that sometimes, I don't want to say that scale and science are mutually exclusive, because that's definitely not true, but there's definitely something to be said for providing an imaginary landscape upon which to set something that gives you more free range to just, do the most artistic thing in the moment. And then maybe marry it to the science as it fits. And I like to see it from both sides of that, that line. So, yeah. Anyway, but I specifically love that scene. So I highly recommend everyone grab 2312 and at least read the first 15 or 20 pages. Because that is, so good. And we got to hear him read it aloud, and it was great.
We did.
Another great book in terms of setting that's not set in our solar system, which might provide us a platform to talk about in and out of imaginary, or imaginary solar systems versus ours, is Sheri Tepper's Grass. And for those of you who haven't read Sheri Tepper, or haven't listened to this podcast and me ramble on about Sheri Tepper in the past, she's done a lot of different kinds of books. Some of them are a little bit more fantastical than others, but Grass specifically feels like a super grounded text in all the right ways. Very landscape driven, It's got a great social experiment going on, great commentary on gender. It ticks a lot of the boxes for what we love to discuss on this podcast. So Grass is a great introductory text to Sheri Tepper, and it just so happens that it's also very planetary in its focus. It's actually, it makes the planet itself part of the subject and the character of the book. And it's not set in our solar system. In fact, it's unclear whether this is, a future, conglomerate of planets that Earth might eventually become a part of, or whether it's just an, alternate reality with science and solar systems. But it and Solaris, in my mind, have a lot in common, despite having a lot that's different, in that they both, and we're talking about the film Solaris, they both are very evocative scenically, and they use that in order to discuss what it means to live on or around a planet and engage with a planet. And I think that is very, very interesting indeed. So I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say about that.
Wow, I have a lot of responses to that. So I'm gonna go through
a couple. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so let me go all the way back to what you said about scale and scope. Because I think you nailed right there one of the major reasons a lot of writers and creators of science fiction have for setting works on worlds. Whether that world is a moon or a planet. And then for those works that are trying to reproduce that feeling of scale and scope, you might choose something that's on the scale of a Dyson sphere or a ring world and not, a smaller space station. But part of the reason I think why alien planets and alien moons can be so evocative is just that you have so much of them. Maybe you're looking at kind of a planet that is, a desert planet or a jungle planet or a water planet or, any of the terms that sort of get thrown around. And I'm thinking here of
like Star Wars
Trek
and Star Trek, yeah.
Right, works that have been around for a while, sort of like, the one system kind of planets. They have one ecosystem, it's the whole planet end. But the other side of that is that you can have planets that are as varied and as complex as Earth, but in different ways, potentially. And there are authors who rise to that challenge magnificently. And I'm thinking here of Ian M. Banks in the Culture series, where he paints some lush and vivid planets that you will just sort of like... His writing is fairly dense already, and he is so descriptive when he gets into these things that are just so, literally otherworldly, that you just kind of like want to lose yourself in what he's creating, the picture that he's painting, this world that he's making. And in a similar way, K.A. Applegate, who wrote the Animorphs books, really loves to do that as well. And, when she wrote the companion books for the Animorphs series, the Chronicles, she does a lot of work away from Earth, dealing with the alien species that are part of that series. And I've heard them described very well as basically culture for young adults, which, and they were kind of contemporaneous, maybe not quite, but K.A. Applegate is also just a fantastic writer, like Ian M. Banks, who can envision things like a sentient alien species that evolved in combination with on a world that had a really hot volcanic surface, and there were these crystals that had exactly the right buoyancy because they were formed with air crystals inside, and the species evolved with the crystals, and the crystals were their homes and floated above the planet's surface. And you never really get into the hows and whys because it's told from the perspective of a member of this bizarre species, but you get via the description of the planet through this person's eyes, or sensory organs. It's not really ever clear if they have eyes, but what that world actually looks like. So, and even that world, which is hot lava surface, crystals floating above it, seems so capacious. Its scope is so large. Its scale is that of a planet, and that's what a planetary body does for a work of science fiction, or can do. It doesn't always have to.
Just the right size to be big, and also small enough for us to grasp the experiment, the social experiment, the ecological experiment going on.
Right. And I suppose when I say scale, what it's really granting to you is the ability to move between scales. So you can sort of be awed with the grandeur of a new and alien planet, but also follow, a character or a small group of characters who are placed in space and time in a very specific location on that planet. So, a world allows you, even, if a work is solely located at one or the other ends of that spectrum, it also allows you to swing between them. You get scale with a world. That is one thing that it allows.
Yeah.
So, definitely a good thing. I also, because you mentioned grass, I want to bring up this cohort of works that really focus upon the new planetary ecologies that alien planets allow you to explore. And Grass was the very first book I thought of when I was thinking of, what are the big ways we can talk about alien planets? And it really set me down that path of, okay, well, how can we talk about how authors treat ecology? Thinking about both the parts of a planet and its various ecosystems that are life, maybe as we know it or don't know it, and are not life. As, if you're looking at a red dwarf versus a trinary star and how that's impacted the life on that planet and how it impacts how the characters are perceiving that planet. And by
trinary star, I assume you're referring to Liu Cixen's Three Body Problem series.
Yeah, yes, that was the first thing that came to mind.
Yeah.
Indeed.
And so what are some of the other texts that you're thinking of?
Well, I would be absolutely appalled if I didn't mention Dune, which occupies, an interesting place in my particular history of science fiction, but I have to give it mad props for being one of the first science fiction books that really focused on planetary ecology, that said, here's a new world. This book is interested in, among many other things, how that world's ecology functions. And Dune is, it's right there in the name, it's kind of a one ecosystem type of planet, but what Frank Herbert does is explores that to its greatest potential and sort of answers the question before anyone had really asked it, how can one planet just be a single ecosystem? And he drills hard into how that can happen.
And he really goes deep into both the ecological experiment as well as the social experiment of Dune and the planet. The planet is called Arrakis, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And then, I know there's a couple other texts that do similar things, and you mentioned in the show notes Nicola Griffith's Ammonite, and the Forever War, which I'm not as familiar. Some of the worlds in Forever War, I'm assuming. And I'm also interested in another book that you listed on the show notes, which is The Sparrow. And we keep coming back to Mary Doria Russell, kind of taking snapshots of things that we like about her books. And I'm thinking we'll come back to talk about her individually at some point, because there's a lot more going on in The Sparrow and Children of Time, that duology, than just the ecological experiment on the planet. But it certainly has that as a component, a major component of the book.
Yes. And one of the reasons that I listed The Sparrow specifically, and listed it as an example of this idea of exploring other planets' ecologies and thinking about how those alien ecosystems are combined and, what that presents you with on the page or, on the screen, whatever you're looking at. But what The Sparrow does that these other works really don't do is it compares and contrasts this alien world with Earth. You're following this group of characters who start on Earth, who are then on a starship for a while and then arrive on an alien world. So you really get to see the differences between Mary Doria Russell's alien planet and what these characters experienced on Earth. And, a lot of that is social, a lot of that is learning how the different aliens on the planet, because there are two sentient species of alien in this book series, how they interact with each other, but, by doing so, you get a lot of their natural history as well and the ecology of their world, which is a really interesting move.
And the comparison is heightened by the fact that she uses a time slip, so the chapters are alternately set on Earth in the future. And then the other, thread follows the main characters as they travel from Earth to this other planet. So in the one narrative, you have that dynamic component of movement and the transition, and then in the other thread you have like a future hindsight kind of situation set up that's really, really interesting because it provides commentary on the differences as you are witnessing the differences, which is really, really interesting.
Right, absolutely. And that's something that, I don't think a lot of works do, in part because some of them definitionally cannot do it if they're set so far in the future or, in another universe or something like that. But I think that if they are more contemporary in their temporal setting and they're focused on, characters who know where Earth is or might have lived on Earth or something, the authors might be falling back on the reader bringing their experiences of what living on Earth is like, and therefore not needing to engage in that way in the book, that kind of like dichotomy between here's an alien world and here's Earth, by comparison, which is not to say that all works need to do that. I don't think they do, but I think that setting some or all of a book on an alien world really allows for this investigation into not only what that alien world does, but also what Earth does. And, really getting back to this first question that I asked, which is, what is a planet? What does it mean to be a planet? What does a planet do? And authors that explore that by thinking about how Earth and an alien planet might be different, might be similar, really stretch their imaginations and then their readers' or viewers' imaginations when it comes to thinking about this, what is a planet question.
Yeah, definitely. And in kind of taking a slant segue from what you're saying, I want to talk a little bit about maybe some of how this connects to weird sci-fi. And I'm not certain if we should save this for the very end as a transition into our next podcast, which will be exclusively about weird sci-fi.
Oh, that's kind of a good idea.
Yeah, so just know that that's coming, listeners, because that's something that we want to highlight, and I just wanted to kind of bring it up now so that you know it's coming around. We're definitely going to talk more about weird sci-fi here in the next, 20 minutes. But let's talk, too, about what or how the planetary relates to, quote-unquote, big air quotes, Cli-Fi, which is to say climate-focused science fiction. And this is a big deal this year, in part because you've had a load of reports coming out over the last 5 years that we're living in the hottest year on record, year after year. It just gets hotter. And so just this year alone, you have articles in The Guardian, The Verge, The New York Times, The Chicago Review of Books, NPR, Sci-Fi, the Barnes & Noble blog, and like loads more. This is just like what showed up on the first page of results when I looked it up. But of like lists of the best climate change related novels or the best Cli-Fi that's out there. People are obsessed with Cli-Fi in 2017. And it's when you look at the list of books, they're all pretty much tapping on all of these points that we've been talking about scope and the opportunities that landscape provides, about the ecological opportunities of planetary-based sci-fi, about the social experiment and how that intersects, and all these good things. So when you think of Cli-Fi, do you think of it as an exclusively planetary thing, or do you think of it as related, but not?
I think that's a really good question, and I would have to go back a little bit. So I'm going to say pause, rewind. Not actually in what you said, but like actually in works that we're talking about, because, and for good reason, Cli-Fi is a big thing right now, and that is awesome because science fiction is leading the way and saying, hey, we gotta think about this shit, which is cool. But if I'm thinking about where that, particular, and I don't think that term has been around for very long, but works that would slot into that genre or subgenre, they tend to be older works that I'm thinking of, and not really new things. So I'm thinking of, for example, J.G. Ballard's The Drowned World, or Brian Aldiss's Hot House, or Thomas Dish's The Genocides, all of which kind of take this idea of future Earth. The climate has changed a whole lot in whatever ways. In both The Drowned World and Hot House, it's a lot warmer and a lot wetter. And then kind of, doing this science fantasy-ish take on a world ruled by jungle, how evolution occurs when everything's super hot, how humans are getting outcompeted left and right by species that are better able to deal with these new conditions. And not to say that that's, in any ways superior to or better than the works that are coming out now, because obviously the works that are coming out now are responding to an ongoing global crisis and have a lot of actual science to fall back on. But these works really set the stage for thinking about far future Earths that might as well be alien planets.
Do you think that really holds up, though, for something like another Kim Stanley Robinson, New York 2140 or 2040? I don't even know. It has a 40 in it, I'm pretty sure. And then like Holly Goddard Jones' The Salt Line, which we've both read, and Mad Adam by Margaret Atwood, another one of our perennial favorites. Do you think that holds up with the more recent, quote-unquote, big quotes, Cli-Fi?
I think, originally you asked, do those works take a planetary scope? And I think that's kind of, again, what you're asking now. And I would say yes. I think that a lot of that climate fiction, just because the climate system is itself on the scale of the planet, that if you are, if you're an author, if you're a creator dealing with works that are thinking about consequences of shifting climates, you are necessarily involved in planetary scopes. And, again, planetary scale gives you that ability to go between the scale of the whole planet or the scale of a couple of characters in one location. And so by doing that, you get some works that really focus on the former, some works that focus on the latter, some works that are somewhere in between. Like, if I'm thinking of Kim Stanley Robinson generally, he is both a really located writer, but also a really planetary writer. But if I was to compare that to Margaret Atwood or to Omar El-Khadd's American War, both of which are, definitely circling around that subgenre, what they're dealing with on the page is very focused, laser focused to like a few characters and the world that they inhabit. But the world that they're illustrating in the white space of those works is planetary. And it has to be. Its scope has to be planetary, because we wouldn't understand what's happening unless we sort of go in with this understanding of what has occurred, of what the planet is like.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I like that. Are we ready to talk about fantasy yet?
Yeah, please. Okay. Let's do it.
I want to shift gears a little bit. Because both of us have read recently La Belle Sauvage by Philip Pullman, which go out and buy this book, folks. It is worth your trip to Barnes & Noble, however fruitless your search at Costco may be. There's a story there. But it reminded me that there's a whole slew of fantastical texts, and I'm thinking here of His Dark Materials, in addition to La Belle Sauvage, and Neil Gaiman's Stardust, and Shauna Maguire's Wayward Children, and even, Paper Girls, the comic series by Brian K. Vaughan. All of these are not quite Earths, but they're also not any other Earths. They are definitely set on Earth or in an alternate version of our Earth. And I was kind of curious about your thoughts about how fantasy texts how they use the planet in similar ways or different ways from sci-fi authors, and how that may or may not relate to our sort of central question of how does the planetary operate in science fiction and fantasy?
Cool. Okay, so to answer this question, I'm going to go in a really weird direction, which is back to Solaris. Let's go back to Solaris. Because I think what Solaris does, whether you're talking about the book or either of the movies, although I think it's most prevalent in the book, just because there's so much room to actually, like, explicate these things. But Solaris kind of takes as its object of analysis the planet itself, the planet Solaris, and how it's kind of unknowable. You have these people who are interested in what's going on, who, have words to describe what's happening, kind of, who interact with the planet or not in ways that are mind-boggling, and, it's a fantastic work of historical science fiction, but kind of, going to that point of they want to know what this world is like. And they're really that goal of knowing in, scientifically, really, because it's a work of science fiction, is what grounds Solaris and makes it readable, as opposed to just, a wall of text that's, like, imagining this bizarre planet and what it might be like. And you can disagree with me on the readability of Solaris. I think in some ways it hasn't aged very well, so I might agree with some disagreement there. But my point there is that Solaris is both large and small. It is as small as this is the thing we're thinking about, this is the thing we're studying, and as large as this is an entire world that we do not understand in any way and is doing things beyond its boundaries that we don't understand. So, taking that, putting that out there, there's Solaris. What fantasy does is, in a kind of twisted way, the same thing. We're not interested in knowing alternate worlds the same way in most works of fantasy, because they're works of fantasy. Maybe if they're works of science fantasy, and I'm thinking of, like, the Marie Brennan Dragon books, where she's a naturalist.
Yeah, Memoirs of Lady
Dragons.
Trent, yes.
Like, yeah. That's kind of in that vein of science fantasy or fantastic science or something. Anyway, but, like, if you have a book or a series like His Dark Materials or Seanan McGuire's Wayward Children, those books are kind of putting out there both new world, which may or may not be a new planet, and as well as this other way of knowing them, this non-scientific way of knowing them, the non-Solaris way of knowing them, this way that's presented to us kind of a priori. Like, here's this world, you have no experience in it, what's an alethiometer, what's a demon, what is anbaric power, figure it out. Or in Wayward Children, you wandered through a door, you were a kid, maybe you followed a fairy, maybe you followed something else, but you're suddenly in another world. Figure it out. And in a lot of cases, these worlds are presented through the eyes of narrators who are not scientists, who are not looking at them either as something that's new, as all alien worlds are when you're looking at science fiction, because you have characters and writers who are calling them alien, and also don't have the faculties to sort of think about knowing them in a certain way, knowing them in that scientific way. And so there's, a different way of engaging with what that new world is.
I think that's fascinating. And I'm happy with your take. Entirely happy.
Cool. Yeah. Nice.
Next!
Neat. Next and answer.
Done. Podcast over. I mean, I'm only joking by 5 minutes, so...
Totally, but I think that's, not to completely turn that into a monologue, but I think that's a really interesting question to ask, because it's easy for me to think about a universe like that of His Dark Materials or the Wayward Children series as not really sharing a lot of the same genetic information with books in science fiction that are also introducing and exploring new worlds. And yet there is something importantly similar about what those kind of works are doing. And I think it really, part of how they're different comes down to that mode of exploration, that mode of knowing that's going on for the characters and the authors themselves as they're creating these worlds.
I agree. And I think, I mean, it's hard for me to put my finger on it, but I feel like both science fiction and fantasy, and wherever you fall on the spectrum between the two, I think they're all doing something more than just spicing up the quote-unquote real world. But it's kind of hard for me to put my finger on what it is that they're all doing and whether there is a shared DNA. And maybe we're trying too hard to find that shared DNA and kind of not allowing it to be this messy process that it really is. Because when you write a book about Mars or the moon, like, that's part of your central premise. It is a guiding plot point, or it's a guiding architectural detail of your book.
Yes.
Whereas if you don't make a specific planet, especially in our solar system with all the science that we have on that specific planet, the center of your book, then you have suddenly a little bit more room to cram other things in, perhaps.
Yes.
Emotionally or, like, literally in terms of, like, the room on the page. So... yeah, I think that there is going to be more slippage and more mess when it comes to talking about planets that are not specific to our solar system or don't have these sort of central archetypal guiding stars. Oh man, that was really a messy metaphor. But, you know, like Mars and the moon have specific symbolic meaning in literature and, you know, in daily life in a way that, like, Charon and Pluto do not yet, but might eventually.
Right. Yeah.
You know? And so I think it's come time for us to kind of figure out, you know, a neat exit plan for this podcast, right? Like, I'm not imaginating.
No, you're right. And I think that exit plan is exactly what you said before. Let's get weird with
Let's get weird. All right. So what do you have for us in terms of weird?
Well, as per usual, I'm kind of going back to Jeff Vandermeer and getting into that weird fiction. Area X.
Darn that guy. He's just taking over the whole genre.
He has. Well, I mean, there are lots of other people I want to talk about when we talk about weird stuff in our next podcast. But, you know, thinking about Area X, and again, kind of that same dichotomy that Mary Doria Russell has going in The Sparrow for what is Earth and what is not, and how on the surface of Earth do you get that sort of planetary, that otherworldly, other planetary weirdness without actually leaving the planet at all. And Jeff Vandermeer is really great at doing that, both in the Area X trilogy and his newest book, Born. But by no means is he the only person to do that. You get in lots of weird books that, in sort of like, you know, the Lovecraft tradition, that is kind of the bread and butter, taking what's known about Earth and flipping it right on its head and making it as alien as possible. And I'm thinking everything, you know, from the actual works of Lovecraft to something as rumble-tumble fun as Pacific Rim to, like, the novella that we both love, that we've talked about many times, The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow. So there's a lot of, you are reading or watching a world that is both so familiar and so alien at the same time that it's very unsettling and yet really pleasurable.
And that disjointure. Yeah, like the confounded expectation of what our planet should be like and isn't in this particular book. Yeah. Well, I mean, whether or not it's Earth or a surrogate Earth, because I'm thinking the Dream Quest of Velebo, like a lot of Lovecraftian fiction, it doesn't really specify that we're on any particular planet. It just has people doing a thing on the world, in the world.
Right. So that's a really good example, too, of kind of straddling that line between a fantasy world where our primary method or mode of knowing the world is not scientific, and science fiction in which our primary mode of knowing the world is scientific in some way, because the protagonist of Velvet Bow, strangely enough, is a scientist, a mathematician. And so her way of knowing the world, that strange world that she's in, is very scientific, and yet, because it's hers, because it's not new to her, she doesn't spend the time that we might spend in a work of science fiction when a world is new, sort of understanding it. And so when she, spoiler, goes to our Earth at the very end of the novella, that flips everything on its head. And that, again, that dichotomy between the Earth that we know, the Earth that we're so familiar with, and this world that Velvet Bow inhabited, this very, very alien world that she inhabited, is so pleasurable and such a fantastic way to end that book that I still am. I'm just, this turned into like I love Velvet Bow again.
Which is okay by me because it's on my list of like top comfort reads. So if I'm having a rough day and I need to feel better about life, I'm either going to read The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow or La Belle Sauvage because oh man, that was such a good book too. So yeah, I think that's, oh man, that I don't think it's unjustified to spend that time talking about Velvet Bow because we've talked about it in the past, and I would reiterate that the modern novella, especially some of the ones that we've talked about on this podcast, the modern novella, with its brevity and its attention to detail, does so much work with so little space. And Velvet Bow, in my mind, is the premier example of that. It's so packed, and yet it's so graceful on the sentence level. It is, I mean, if I was, drinking wine or eating cheese, I would just be like smacking my lips and, doing that thing with your fingers you do when you're like, that's so good,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, maybe I've been watching too much of the Great British Baking Show.
Probably.
No.
That's always okay. That's always a good thing. But I think this is actually a great way for us to say, please join us next time when we're going to talk more about Lovecraftian stuff, Jeff Vandermeer, Velvet Bow, all of these, as we kind of tackle what weird is nowadays. When we've used this word a lot, talking about weird fiction, how it kind of is like science fiction and fantasy and horror and other things, but also not those things at the same time. So we're going to try not to pin down what it is, but rather to explore all the ways that we think about it. So join us next time. I think that'll be a lot of fun. And in the meantime, where can you find us?
You can find us all over the stinking place. And in fact, I have one of my top things that I wanted to exit the podcast with was a reminder to visit our beautifully updated and revised website, thanks to Tony, which you can find at www.imaginaries.net. And my second plug was for you to hop on our Twitter, which you can find at the handle imaginary_pod. And the reason why you should hop on Twitter is to click on the links and follow the links to vote on several categories of books that we will be considering for Imaginary Awards in, the beginning of 2018. We're going to look back on 2017, vote on our favorite books, films, comics, and especially with comics, we'd love for you to weigh in on that. There's a couple links there for new and ongoing series. And also, I would hope that you guys would hop on there and vote on the books that we haven't yet read and that we need to cram in before we vote on the best books of 2017. So if you see a book or see that there is a hole that needs to be filled with a book that you just absolutely think we must read before we hand out our Imaginary Awards, please hop on there and, enter, add titles as you will. We can ignore the ones that we have happened to read. So it's safer to add a book that you don't see than it is to not vote because you don't see it. So go ahead and please hop on there. And my third plug is that just keep coming back because we have such a fantastic lineup for the end of this year and the beginning of next year.
Yes,
and we haven't covered every book about every planet. Like a great example is, Andy Weir just came out with his new book, Artemis, and that happens to be set on the moon, and we didn't have time to review it before we did our moon podcast before we recorded it. So, there's so many books, and these are coming out every month, and we are very excited to consume more books and talk more about planets in the future. future. We might not do it in quite the same format, but there's so much to talk about in the realm of sci-fi and fantasy as we, sashay into 2018. So please find us on our website, and you can drop us a line there, or you can do so by Twitter. We also have individual Twitters, but honestly, just tweet our main account and we'll get back to you much faster that way. So yeah. Anything else, Tony?
Yep.
Have I missed
anything?
anything?
That's good. That's it. You have missed nothing.
I have missed nothing.
Concrete.
I have polished that floor. Cinderella would be proud.
She would.
Yep. All right. So, you want to take us out?
Yes. We're out.
We're out. Bye.
Bye.